that were forgotten when Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. So we talked about, and we had mention of how many halachas were forgotten. And the last thing we learned earlier about shloishes halachim halachis nishtakchu, which is 3,000 halachas were forgotten. Now we're going to learn a piece of Gemara where the Gemara says 700 halachas were forgotten. Later we learn on about a different number, 1,700 were forgotten. But regardless, we'll get to that soon. But the point of it, that there were many halachas that were forgotten at the time that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away. And as we said, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, Moshe kibel Torah meSinai u'mesara liYehoshua. Moshe receives the Torah from Sinai, from Har Sinai, which is what we're going to be celebrating. Shavuos, the time of Matan Torah, and as we said, it's 3,333 years, a very special birthday of Matan Torah, and we celebrate that as the giving of the Torah, and everything that Moshe Rabbeinu received from Har Sinai is what Misarei LeYehoshua. He then gives it over to Yehoshua, and from Yehoshua it's given over to the Zekanim, and so on. And it's that which we have as the Torah, everything in the Torah. Kol ma shetalmid vasik asik lechadesh nemra leMoshe miSinai. We've learned, the Gemara tells us that everything that is true Torah is only something that Moshe Rabbeinu received at Sinai. If somebody comes up with something new that was not given to Moshe Rabbeinu, that's not Torah. So, there's an expression, a chiddush. I don't know if any of you have heard that expression. Often it's used in the yeshiva world. Wow, this is a chiddush, something new, nobody ever heard of before. I came up with something new. So actually, the Rebbe Rashab once used the expression, he says, if this is something that nobody ever heard before, then it's not Torah. Because anything that is true Torah, we've heard before. Moshe Rabbeinu heard it, and he taught it to Yehoshua. And if this is what you're referring to as a true chiddush that nobody heard before, then this is not Torah. If you want to, you can explain what you learned. You can give an interpretation of what you learned. You can share it with somebody else. But to come about and say, this is something new, entirely new, nobody ever heard this one. It might be true, but it also tells us it's not Torah. But anyway, so the Gemara tells us now, if you want to just go back a little bit, go down 2 lines. One more line. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav. Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav that B'shah Shenifta Moshe Rabbeinu leGan Eden, when Moshe Rabbeinu was departing from this world and he was going to Gan Eden, Amru Lei LeYehoshua. So Moshe Rabbeinu says to Yehoshua, what does he say to Yisroel? So the Gemara reveals to us now a conversation that took place between Moshe Rabbeinu and Yehoshua as Moshe was about to leave the world. He said to him, Sha'al mimenu kol sveikus sheyesh lecha. Now's your chance. Any doubts that you have, you can now ask me. Sha'al mimeni. If you have a doubt, if you have a question, ask me. So Amar Loi. So the Gemara tells us, Amar Loi. So Yeshua replies to Moshe Rabbeinu, Rabbi, my teacher, Klum hinachticha shah achas valachti lemokim acher. What are you telling me? I should ask you something that I have a question about. Why do you think I have any questions? Klum hinachticha shah achas. Did I ever leave you? Did I ever leave your side? And valachti lemokim acher, and I went someplace else? I've always been alongside you. And anytime you taught Torah, I was right there. And I was right there because you say that clearly. Have you not written that about me? Yeshua says to Moshe, you said that about me. You testified about me. You said in Torah, it says, it says that his servant, referring to Yeshua, that Yeshua ben Nun, who was Moshe's servant, lo yamush mitoicha oyel, would not step aside from the tent of Moshe. So in other words, Yeshua is saying to Moshe, I don't get it. You're telling me, in case I have any questions, I should ask you. I have questions. I heard everything from you. It was so clear, and you told it to me, and there was nothing I missed. Why should I have any questions? So the Gemara says, Miyad Toshesh Koichei Shel Moshe, that when Yeshua uses this expression, so Moshe Rabbeinu's strength waned because he wasn't very happy with the response of Yeshua. Yeshua is, so to say, challenging Moshe Rabbeinu and saying, wait a second. Moshe Rabbeinu is saying to him, in case you have any questions, ask. And Yeshua is saying, why should I have any questions? So obviously Moshe Rabbeinu was trying to clarify things in a better way. But Yeshua took it as if maybe Moshe thought he forgot something. So Moshe Rabbeinu was somewhat taken aback that Yeshua should respond that way. And the Gemara says, because of that kind of a response, 300 laws of Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu actually taught Yeshua were forgotten by Yeshua. That at that point he forgot 300 halachas. And the Neildulai Shvamei Sveikos, and 700 uncertainties, Sveikos, a suffix, something that's uncertain. There were 700 uncertainties that all of a sudden Yeshua became aware of. And the Amdu Kol Yisroel Lahorgoi. And as we said, the expression is that the Gemara uses such a tough expression that Amdu Kol Yisroel Lahorgoi, that people wanted to kill him. Obviously, they didn't want to kill him, but they were so upset with Yeshua. Why would he do something to cause 300 halachas to be forgotten? What are we going to do now? Moshe Rabbeinu taught it to you and only to you, and because you responded the way you did, you forgot 300 halachas. They were very upset with you, with Yeshua. So Amalei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so Hashem says to Yeshua, because Yeshua, what did Yeshua do? Obviously, he turned to Hashem and he said, Hashem, inspire me, help me remember those halachis that Moshe Rabbeinu taught me. So he asks Hashem to remind him, to help him remember. So Amalei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so Hashem responds to Yeshua, I cannot tell you these halachas that you forgot. I said it to Moshe, and Moshe is the one that received Torah from Hashem, and you have to receive it from Moshe, and since you forgot, I cannot be the one to tell it to you. You have to have received it from Moshe. So, I can't tell you the forgotten laws. That's impossible. What then? Instead, Hashem says to him, go and occupy Bnei Yisroel with a war. This was at the time when Moshe Rabbeinu had instructed Yeshua to enter Eretz Yisrael, to lead Bnei Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael. And in order to lead Bnei Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael, he had to conquer Eretz Yisrael from the nations of the world that were there in Eretz Yisrael at that point. So in order to conquer them, they had to fight a war. So what Hashem says to Yeshua, I'll tell you what you should do. you go and lead them in this war. And when they see what they can get, when they appreciate what they've gotten, Eretz Yisroel, they'll let you go. They'll be okay with, in spite of the fact that 300 halachas were forgotten. In other words, he said, give them a gift, get them Eretz Yisrael, and this is the time right now, lead them into Eretz Yisrael, get them involved in conquering Eretz Yisrael, and I will be along their side in helping them conquer Eretz Yisrael, and they'll be okay with you, because they'll see what you've done for them. And as the pasuk says, Shenemar, as it says, Vayihi achri Moshe Eved Hashem Vayimer Hashem, and it was after Moshe Rabbeinu passes away, and Hashem says to Yeshua, and the pasuk goes on and tells us that what does he say to Yeshua? He tells him that he should be the one to go and lead Bnei Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael and lead them with the wars against the nations of the world. So that's where the Gemara shares with us that they had forgotten so many things. Now, something similar, the Gemara goes on and says, and often we have where there is one part of the Gemara, or one thing that was transmitted in the Gemara with this story, and a similar story was given over in a different yeshiva. And the Gemara tells us that it was taught in a different braisa, in a different yeshiva, that Elef Ushva Meyes Kalin Vachamurin, that there were 1,700 Kalin Vachamurin. There's what's referred to as a Kal V'Chomer. A Kal V'Chomer is where you sometimes say, if in such a situation the halacha is such and such, then certainly in a less difficult situation, it certainly would be like this. So that's one of the ways that we can derive halachas of Torah. The Torah gives it to us in the stricter situation, and we can then say, if in the stricter situation this is the halacha, so in a more lenient one, it certainly should apply. So that's referred to as a kal v'chomer. So the Gemara says that at that point, 1,700 kal v'chomers were forgotten. That's what this piece of Gemara tells us. And also Gzeira Shavas. A Gzeira Shava is also where there's one word mentioned in one pasuk, another word mentioned in another pasuk, a similar word, and we compare the words and we say that the halachas that are mentioned here also apply over there, and it's for that reason that the Torah uses the same words in the same psukim, in these different psukim, to teach us that we should learn from one pasuk to another. That's referred to as a Gzeira Shava, a similar kind of decree, a similar kind of halacha. Similar, the similarity is that it uses the same words in one pasuk, it uses the same words in another pasuk, so we apply what says in one pasuk, and we say the same things would apply in the other pasuk that has the similar words. So there too, there were, and in order to know these things, we have to have had received this. A person can't just get up one morning and say, hey, you know what, I just realized there's a similar word here and a similar word there, so we'll apply the halachas from one to another. That doesn't work that way. A Gzeira Shava and a Kal V'Chomer are the kinds of things that you have to have had received from your teacher. Your teacher taught you that this is one of those things that we can learn from a Gzeira Shava or a Kal V'Chomer. And so too, the Gdukei Seifrim. So too, there are certain things that the Chachamim came along and derived something from the way the Torah expresses itself. The Torah says it in this way rather than in some other way, so that we can derive a particular halacha. So that too is one of those things that we have to have our teacher teach us that. So there are many things, on the one hand, we take a look at Torah and we say it's very clear, Torah Shabbat, it's written. But what's very clear and what's very written, you have the Chamishe Chumshe Torah, the 5 books of what's referred to the 5 books of Moshe Rabbeinu. The entire Shas is in those 5 books. Where in those 5 books did he have the entire Shas? Thousands upon thousands of pages of Gemara in those 5 little books of Chumash. So it's as we just said, there's Kal V'Chomer, there's Gzeira Shava, there's Dukdei Seifrim, there's all kinds of different ways that we derive halachas. And if you want to know what they are, take a look at davening in the morning. First, just before Hoidu, there's the karbanos, the sacrifices. But just before we say Hoidu, we say what's referred to as Rabbi Yisroel Eimer. Rabbi Yisroel says, and he says, B'shloish esrei midos haTorah nidreshes, that there are 13 different ways that we can derive halachas of Torah. And he goes on to list them. And you can take a look at what they are. And those are the ways that the Gemara and all the sages of the Gemara derived the halachas from the psukim of Chumash. And that's where they came up with the Gemara. And that's where along the way, there were different ways of the way it was received from teacher to student. It was given over from teacher to student. Sometimes there were disagreements. Sometimes there were arguments. Famous story with Rabbi Akiva and all of his students where they disagreed with one another. They were all students of Rabbi Akiva, and yet 24,000 of them couldn't agree to what it is that Rabbi Akiva said. And they had those disagreements. And as the Rebbe explains, it wasn't that they didn't have Avas Yisroel for one another, that they didn't love one another and they were fighting with one another. If anything, as the Rebbe explains, it was quite the opposite. They loved each one so much that if their friend didn't understand it, the words of Rabbi Akiva the way they did, they just couldn't deal with it. What do you mean you don't understand it? Let me explain it to you. And they would go over and over and over. And this is what looked like the disagreements. And it was in fact disagreements, but it wasn't that they didn't love one another, but as the expression is, sheleinohagu kavod zeh lozeh. They didn't honor one another, meaning that they disagreed, but you're allowed to disagree, but respect the other person's what he thinks. And they loved each other so much that they couldn't stand that you didn't get it the way I think is the 100% the right way. So they did all they can to convince the other guy. But that's the point of leinohagu kavod. They didn't respect one another like a husband and wife. They don't have to necessarily agree with one another, but they have to respect one another's opinion. And that's what was missing. And that's what occurs all the time throughout Shas, throughout the Gemara, throughout Talmud Bavli. We have these arguments, and it's based on how do we derive something from a pasuk? Which pasuk do we derive it from? How do we derive it from this pasuk? And on, and that's where we get thousands of pages of Gemara. But we'll stop here with the Gemara, and we'll continue on tomorrow in Yirtz Hashem, where the Gemara tells us how these issues were finally resolved, that in spite of the fact that they forgot so many halachas, but in the end, obviously Hashem didn't leave them forgetting the halachas. He figured out how they could be once again reminded of those halachas. And as we said, everything is in Torah, and Moshe Rabbeinu handed us the 5 books of Torah, and everything is there. So in the later generations, great sages came about and were able to derive from the Chumash all of these halachas that were forgotten. And they finally, as the Gemara tells us, were able to retain all the halachas, all the Gzeira Shabbos, and everything that they forgot at one point. Later generations, great sages came about and were able to remind them of it. Okay, I think we're going to stop here so I can get to shul on time. And we usually go to a letter from the Rebbe, but we'll skip it today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And in Yirtz Hashem, tomorrow, we will do Ein Yaakov at 7:15. Okay, we'll try to keep Ein Yaakov to 7:15 now, so that the evenings that we have other classes, we'll try